Good evening. Welcome. My name is Rex Fuller. I'm the CEO at the Center on Colfax in Denver, Colorado. And welcome to our Read It or Don't book group. We're glad to have you here tonight to talk about a really interesting book and excited to have our two guests talk about it. Before we get started, I would like to read our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge with respect that the Center on Colfax stands on the unceded traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Pueblo, and Shoshone nations. Further, we acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to the lands that comprise what is now called Colorado. We recognize Indigenous peoples as the original stewards of this land and honor their sacrifices and hardships. And we recognize that colonialism continues to affect modern Indigenous people. Tonight's book that we're going to be discussing is A Two-Spirit Journey by Ma-Nee Chacaby. It's the autobiography of a lesbian Ojibwa Cree elder. And we have two guests who are going to join us tonight to discuss this book. Let me bring them into the studio here. Welcome. Thank you for being part of tonight's book discussion. I'd like to invite both of you to please introduce yourselves and share how you identify and what pronouns you prefer to use. Terry, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Rex. My name is Terry. I am a Shegi or Two-Spirit, Eastern Cherokee. I'm reconnected but not enrolled with my tribe. And my pronouns are she or them.
Thank you. And Chris Osto, welcome.
Well, thank you, Rex, and thank the LGBT Center of Colorado for having us here tonight. My name is Crisosto Apache, and I was born and raised on the Mescalero Apache Reservation in New Mexico. I'm part Chiricahua, I'm part Mescalero, and I'm also part Dene, which is Navajo. Let's see what else. My pronouns. I use the letter X to represent my pronoun, which I understand now that it is gender nonconforming. So my pronoun that I go by is Crisosto. And I can probably explain that if you want me to, why I decided X.
Well, go ahead. It'd be interesting to hear because pronouns have become so important to so many people, and it's interesting to learn about the different ways that people use them.
Well, the story behind that, I mean, it took me a long time to sort of get to where I'm at in terms of how I understand my own identity. I grew up on the Mescalero Apache Reservation, so and I left that reservation fairly early, and I knew about my sexual orientation at an early age. But then as I started to sort of acquaint myself with more information and more knowledge, I started to realize that there was the concept of homosexuality, gayness, queerness, and all of that. So I started to embrace some of those earlier terms, but moving through life, it sort of introduced me to the term Berdache, and then later on to the term Two-Spirit, which I seem to have identified a lot more. And then coming out to my family a lot earlier, I came out as gay. But then later on, when I found the term Two-Spirit, I later came back and said I switched my mind. It's now Two-Spirit. But then as I start to sort of look at my own identity and how that pairs with, as you mentioned earlier, colonization, I realized that the term Two-Spirit does originate from a colonization perspective because it's in English, even though that there's a huge tie to a lot of tribal communities that use the term. So that made me go deep, dig a little bit deeper to find out more names. So I found names that are traditional, cultural names that I identify with, even more specifically with the Apache and San, and then also the Navajo Natle. So for me, those parts are more specific to who I am. So in a lot of ways, I sort of don't use Two-Spirit anymore because I'm trying to see myself in a more decolonized way, which brings about the idea of X, which is a gender nonconforming, which means I don't look at myself in either of those categories, that I just am human. So I identify with my pronoun, with my name.
Thank you so much for sharing that, and I appreciate your perspective so much. Um, uh, Thank you. I really appreciate the chance to learn about that. I'd like to go ahead and start our book discussion. I would like to mention that we have produced this series of book events in cooperation with the Denver Public Library, and we discovered this book on their LGBTQ reading list. So thank you to the Denver Public Library for helping us find this book. And to start the discussion, I'd actually like to just read the very first paragraph of the book because I think it will give people who are watching a sense of what the book is about. And also, one more comment before we begin. If you're watching on Facebook Live and you have a question or a thought that you'd like to share, you can feel free to enter it in the comments and we'll be able to see it here and we can answer questions and that sort of thing. So let me just read this real quick. This is the author. My name is Ma-Nee Chacaby. I am Ojibwa Cree elder, and I have both a male and female spirit inside of me. I have experienced a long, complicated, and sometimes challenging journey over the course of my life. My earliest memories are of gathering kindling, making snowshoes, and hunting and trapping in my isolated Canadian community where alcoholism was widespread in the 1950s. In 2013, more than a half century later, I performed a healing ceremony and then helped lead the first gay pride parade in my city, Thunder Bay, Ontario. This book describes the extraordinary path that led me to this place. So, my first question is just a simple one. What did you all think about the book? What were your impressions? What were some of your favorite elements? Feel free, whoever has a thought, to start.
Chris, you look like you have something to say. Go ahead.
I was going to say, let's play, what do you call it? Paper, scissors. No, I thought this was a very good book. I mean, I think when I purchased it a couple of years back, I really enjoyed reading it for the first time. And when you said that we were going to have a discussion, I thought, well, that's a really good point to talk about it because I think her story is a necessary story that should be told because there's not enough stories that we hear from Indigenous Two-Spirit people. And it's always nice to see what types of things they discover in their own journeys through life. The book it felt really honest and in a lot of ways very vulnerable. But then you also have the idea of that there was a courageous nature about how she dealt with the adversity in her life, which was very inspiring because I know firsthand some of the instances that she does talk about in the book because of my own family and the reservation I grew up on. But it was really interesting and very nice to sort of go through this emotional journey with her in her telling this story. Because I do believe that we're always searching, that there's parts of us that we sort of want to discover. And so following her through her journey and these discoveries that she comes upon in a lot of ways was very empowering for her and also for myself, knowing that there is other people that are going through the same journey that she is.
Thank you. Terry, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, that whole healing aspect, growing up urban Indigenous and the disconnect, and I think that no matter how much I reconnect to my people, I will always feel that disconnect. And reading her book, it made me feel more solid, more visible. There was a lot of familiarity there. I have a lot of intersections, being queer, being two-spirit, being Indigenous, being, not a binary woman, being disabled, and just all of these things. And I just related in so many ways. A lot of her experiences I've experienced on in a different way or on a smaller scale. There was just so much that was so familiar, and it was healing for me.
Thank you. That's wonderful to hear. Here's another quote from the book. This is from page 64. And Elder Chacaby writes, um, starting when I was a young child, probably when I was 4 or 5 years old, my grandmother told me that I had two spirits. She would gently poke me in the chest and say, "Little girl, you have Nizin Ojiak, or two spirits living inside of you." Please forgive me if I mispronounced that. Over the years, she explained this to me by saying that some people were special and had both a male and a female spirit inside of them. She said two spirit girls often were drawn to activities that boys usually did, like me when I explored the bush and went fishing and trapping. I'd love to encourage you both to share more about how you understand the meaning of a two spirit identity and how it figures in your journey. Chrysosto, you certainly shared some when you were discussing um, your choice of pronouns, but I would love to hear more if you have some thoughts about two spirit identity or how the terms that you would prefer to use.
Um, yeah, it certainly has been a journey in terms of discovering my identity, and I think I have a better sense of who I am now. Uh, when I was a teenager, I knew the idea. I knew that I was attracted to the same sex. I was attracted to men, um, but at the same time, I was looking at my environment and seeing that there was people, they weren't accepting of this idea of being gay or queer or homosexual. In fact, that there was a lot of derogatory aspects to it, and I witnessed that as I was growing up. So I sort of suppressed that a little bit, and I knew I wanted to someday be accepting of who I am and understanding of who I am. It wasn't until I entered college that I started to see how open a lot of the students were, that there were places that you could go and that there were people that were free with their expressions. And so I started to gravitate towards many of the people that I started to have connections with. So the more I had conversations with people, and the more I talked, and the more I started to sort of feel free to sort of examine or explore who I was, then I became a little bit more comfortable. And I started to exhibit that in the way I was dressing, the way I was expressing myself. So, and even then, I wasn't aware of the term two spirit or birdash. I was sort of just associating that all with either being gay, homosexual, or being queer, because those were the terms that I knew at the time. As I moved further into my education, people started to approach me because they knew that I was openly gay. So a lot of students would come up to me and start asking me about the Berdache tradition or the Berdache culture. Again, I didn't know what they were talking about, so it forced me to go and do some research and found
Hmm.
out that, this term or this concept has been around for quite some time. And I started to look into a lot of cultural and traditional um, uh, material and started to find that there were documentation of two-spirit people and culture throughout history.
Thank you for sharing. Terry, did you have thoughts that you'd like to share?
Um, yeah, I think that in modern day, people feel that two spirit is kind of a general term, and it simply means queer or LGBTQ. Um, for me, it took a lot of searching and trying to figure out why I had dreams about a little boy that looked exactly like me, or there was just so many things that I was going through that I didn't understand until um, I got together with a friend from my sister tribe, the Oklahoma Cherokee, and they were telling me, "Wait, you don't know that you have the two spirits inside you. That's your twin brother." So I asked mom, were there any events when you were pregnant with me? And sure enough, twins run in my family, and
Hmm.
so apparently so do two spirits. So for me, my other spirit is my twin brother, and I know there's other ways to be two spirit, to have two spirits. For me, I have had a traumatic and close relationship with death since before I was born. Um, and a lot of two spirits are death workers, and because we walk both worlds when we have that duality, when we have the man and woman spirit. Um, this for me it is not my gender identity, and it's not my sexual orientation, although it has influenced both. My tribe has 12 terms for gender. It's not a binary man, woman, or neither or both.
Mm.
It's a circle. So when you go to a powwow and you see that circle is completed by the two spirits. If they're, we are necessary. Everybody plays a role in your tribe, and if you're two spirit, then you play a two spirit role in your tribe, or you play a shaggy role, or however you fit in. And I think that a lot of people have a hard time finding out how they fit in, and how they contribute to their tribe or their nation or their people. Um, so I have family members who are cis het and two spirit. They have two spirits, but they are not gay, and they are not. They're not in the LGBTQ community at all. So I think that it's different for everybody, and that's why two spirit is such an umbrella term, because it can vary so much.
It sounds like a very expansive term that
It's a
really,
spiritual term.
yeah, that includes a real wide variety of experiences and perspectives. Chrysoso, we got a question that came in through the comments, just asking if you could clarify the term Berdache. I think they were curious about how it was spelled, and just because that's a different term. And if you wouldn't mind sharing that.
Okay. Early on, when I was trying to figure out who I was, like I said, I came across the term Berdache. It's spelled Berdache, and apparently it comes from the Middle East, and it has some derivative in French as well. But the term basically just means like somebody who's kept, like a housekeeper or a servant. Um, in a lot of ways, when a lot of the chapters early on through American history would identify a lot of the people that they witnessed as, men dressing like women, or, vice versa. And they would call them Berdache because a lot of them would seem to be filling the roles as expected by Western concepts. So really, the term Berdache was something that was deemed derogatory, and that was where back in 1989 is when they coined the term Two Spirit, and it does come from the Ojibwe language of the original term that they coined. So the term Two Spirit, I think, is one that is sort of generic. Like Terry says, that it can really just sort of, in Western terms, people can wrap their ideas around that concept, because we're dealing with a lot of different tribes who will have a lot of different terms for Two Spirit people. Just as my tribes that I represent has many terms that they have to define Two Spirit people within their tribal communities. But Berdache was decided back in 1989 at one of the international Two-Spirit gatherings that wasn't a term that they weren't going to associate anymore, and they all decided that Two-Spirit would be the term that would best represent.
Okay, thank you. It's so interesting to learn about the history of this language. So I appreciate you very much sharing that. Let's talk a little bit more about Ma-Nee's history. She describes her early childhood in the 1950s in rural Ontario that includes joyful memories and a close relationship with her grandmother, but she also describes troubles in her community, including repeatedly witnessing abuse against others and being victimized herself, as well as the secrecy that grew up around these issues. Elder Ma-Nee Chacaby also describes her early experiences with alcohol. I was wondering if you all could share your thoughts about this section and why you think it was important for her to share these aspects of her life. Maybe Terry, would you mind starting us off this time?
Boy, that's a rabbit hole. Uh, there's a lot of grooming in indigenous communities, grooming that was done to us by the government. I hear a lot of older generations. They say, "Boy, they sure did a number on us." Um,
Mhm.
I've heard that so many times in my life. Um, I I think that it is important to address these issues because we are in the generation where we are recognizing these uh, patterns of abuse, whether it's alcohol abuse or abuse to each other, and we're recognizing that and breaking those patterns. And I think that Ma-Nee's story really helps us to see that it's okay that we went through this. It's okay that that things that we've done that we might not be proud of, it's important. And in our culture, I think a lot of native tribes in this country, we all feel that it's really important to talk openly and stop being ashamed about things because that's how we heal is by sharing.
Mhm. Mhm. Thank you. Chris, did you have anything that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think Terry touched on a few things with the concept of some of the ideas concepts that Ma-Nee talks about in her story. And I think in order for a lot of people to really understand how this has happened and how it works, you really have to go back in history because this what has happened to indigenous people in North America, it stems from the early development of America, really, and a lot of that has been passed down. I used to have conversations with my mother, and when I was reading this story, it reminded me so much of my mother's history and her mother's history in terms of growing up on the reservation. And a term that I've come to understand that really defines indigenous people in terms of what we're talking about in Ma-Nee's story is the transmission of intergenerational historical trauma.
Mm.
And that idea, I had to sort of stop myself for a minute and think about what that meant. Because I found that term about maybe 15 years ago, and I started to look and start to figure out what that meant. When I look at my own tribal community, and I also look at Ma-Nee's community for what she talked about, it's very unfortunate. And a lot of these tribal communities still struggle with some of these forms of disparities, and it seems to be growing. And I think the idea that she presents in this book is still necessary because how Western culture sees Native American um, ideology or even representation, it still has a romanticism attached to it. People don't really stop to see how much disparity many of these tribal communities deal with. Things such as domestic abuse, sexual assault, gang violence, chemical dependencies, teen pregnancies, mental health issues, poverty, even religious influences. Um, One of the things that I know that most people don't talk about, but she mentions this in her book, is the idea of tribal internal racism, where
Mm.
many of the families are being targeted because of this introduction of Western culture, and it sort of had been pressed on a lot of the tribal communities to think like Westerners, so they sort of embrace some of the concepts. Whereas like religious denomination, they say that two-spirit identities are is wrong and you'll go to hell, which is what she talks about in her book. So a lot of these kinds of encroaching concepts still exist today, and I always talk about them because they're still relevant, and a lot of these numbers are on the rise, especially within the past year of the pandemic. There's a lot of these issues that have really have been pressed upon indigenous communities, and a lot of it really comes through the health issues, the ideas of mental illness or mental health, and chemical dependency. A lot of those have been on the rise. So I think that it's really kind of unfortunate that we have to look at it in those ways. But what we have to do and how we can contribute to how to dismantle that system, I think, is what we should be thinking about now and towards the future.
Yeah. Well, you touched on the idea of generational trauma. In the book, Ma-Nee describes when government officials took members of her family away to residential schools, including her brother, stepsister, and cousins. And residential schools are much in the news lately across as states across the US and Canada are trying to reckon with this past. Could you share your thoughts on the phenomenon of residential schools and their impact on Native communities, and what can be done to find justice for those who are affected by it, or can they find justice?
Either of us. I'll start. Boarding schools, the idea or the concept of boarding schools has sort of been part of the language of my family and the community that I grew up in. Um, and, we didn't really think about them much then, but the more I start to become more aware of what these institutions were, I started to sort of reevaluate what I thought about that. Because one of my family members, Asa DeKluge, who's my great great grandfather, ended up going to Carlisle in Pennsylvania. It was one of the first institutions that was deemed as part of the boarding schools. It was the first one, and he went. There's a book that I've read that my mom gave to me that talks a lot about my family through a historian by the name of Eve Ball, who lived in Ruidoso, which is the border town that I went to school with and sort of grew up with. My mother used to take me there when I was a kid, and she wanted to document as many stories from as many tribal members as she could. So she did a lot of documentation on my family, and did a lot of the writings on Asa DeKluge. And in reading that book, I found out that he did go to the Carlisle, Pennsylvania school. He was enrolled there in 1886, and when he was like around 9 or 10, and was released from there back in 1895 when he turned 18. And from there, he moved back to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where he became a police officer, and then eventually moved back to the reservation where he passed away. I think in 1955 is what my mom told me. But I remember that just some of those stories I found out just through the writing and some of the atrocities that happened there. And even now, some of the stories that we're seeing up in Canada, and even some of the ones that we are discovering here in the United States, I think should deserve a lot of attention, because it deals with a lot of injustice. I was reading an article last month, and I think I posted it on my author page on Facebook, where they discovered in Albuquerque, New Mexico, because I'm from New Mexico, that there was a mass Indian school grave that was rediscovered in the city of Albuquerque, which was part of the Albuquerque boarding school at the time. So I think for me that there are places that are now just coming to recognize that there have been these institutions that are places where kids were sort of shipped to. And I think the idea behind that was sort of a push toward the eradication of Native people, sort of pushing all these kids into boarding schools, which at the time there was a saying, "Kill the Indian but save the man," which was coined by the Lieutenant Richard Harry Pratt, which is what was really the person who developed all these boarding schools to place Native American children in there so that they can forget their language, forget their traditions, and come out an assimilated person.
Hmm. Hmm. Terry, did you have any thoughts you'd want to share?
Residential schools are a little different out here in the Southeast, Southern Appalachia. They were more assimilated. We have a place that I was able to dodge because I was not allowed to talk about being Indigenous growing up, because they were still taking kids. Every other mixed Native kid that I went to school with was labeled a bad kid and placed in this reform school. We called it getting sent off. And, white kids went there too. It wasn't a Native boarding school, but if you were a Native kid, you were going there and you were labeled for life. Terrible things happened there. Um, it's it's still standing, but I don't think that there are mass graves there. Um, Teachers would go around a circuit. They were very passionate about, like Chris said, kill the savage, save the person. They 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 would change their name, write names on a blackboard and give the child a stick, and they'd point at a name. So it was common. A lot of them were A, B, and C names, and one name in particular, my grandfather's name. I will protect their privacy. They don't like me talking about this. But his starts with a C, and it's a rare name, and it's actually common. And I was able to follow it around and trace it to the teacher that
Wow.
that cared, was fond of this name. She thought it was cute. She really cared about the kids. I don't know if she was abusive or not, but um, it's fascinating how you can find out answers by tracing to boarding schools, even if it was removed from the actual indigenous boarding schools. We were very remote. They grew up in Kentucky, so this was not what you would have thought, but it still reached these little one-room schoolhouses way out in the middle of the mountains.
Wow. Thank you.
Now, that kind of reminds me of a story when I was working in the nonprofit sector. I used to go around the country and talk about Two-Spirit people and give presentations on Two-Spirit identity. Um, I was in Lander, Wyoming, giving a presentation up there. And there were tribal elders and tribal people from the Arapaho community that was there. Um, and after the presentation, I was done and I was going to walk out. But this one elder had come up to me and she said, she kind of pulled me aside and she wanted to talk to me. And so I kind of sat down next to her and we began to have a conversation. And one of the things she told me, and I still think about this to this day, is that she remembers when she was a very young girl and had been taken to boarding school. And there were a whole bunch of different tribes mixed in the barracks that they were in. And I was just letting her talk. So she was telling me the story. And she said when she first got there, they were dressed in their traditional outfits, but they were all crowded into one room. The girls were separated from the boys, and so they were made to take the clothes off and change into regular clothes. But as they were stripping one of the children of their clothes, they found that the child was a male child. So once they discovered that, they beat the child, and they said they dragged the child out of that room, saying that that wasn't not supposed to happen. Um, but she said that was the first time that she witnessed and knowing that she comes from a tribe where the identity is embraced and they leave the child in their own life at a very young age. She said that that was the first incident that she remembered of where, she understood that Two-Spirit people were not, were changing.
Hmm. Thank you for sharing those stories. There's so much pain associated with that. Ma-Nee describes in her book her unfulfilling arranged marriage that eventually devolved into an abusive relationship. And after enduring years of abuse from her husband, she finally fought back and the marriage ended. Um, could you share your impressions of this part of the story and some of how that affected you?
Um, I have been in relationships that I didn't want to be in. People convinced me or groomed me, or um, I. My mom was in a really similar marriage. Um, it wasn't quite so brutal, but it's it's almost not just accepted, but expected that Indigenous women will endure this kind of abuse, and my family was not supportive. I had a stepfather that was very abusive. They they never stepped in or interfered. Um, that was that wasn't their business, you know. That was the business of a man and his family, and um, I, a lot of Indigenous women have suffered similar, and it's important to support them.
Thank you for sharing that story. Thank you very much. Chris, did you have any thoughts you wanted to share?
Yeah, the concept of marriage in the book was very interesting. Even how she talked about it almost seemed like it was something of an expectation.
Hmm.
Um, where even if I think she was married twice, right? And then the first one was a very nice big guy, gave her the first child, and then the second one seemed more conventional, where she was not. They were married, but she lived downstairs in the basement. But her approach to this idea of marriage, it seemed more like something that was expected, and in a lot of ways I can see that. Um, and of course, the idea of marriage. I'm not really sure that it may exist in Native American culture. I think it might be something that might have been introduced uh, through the religious denominations that visited a lot of these tribes. I know from Apache history that Apaches didn't really have a system of marriage. That they were, even though they were matrilineal, a lot of them had many partners,
Hmm.
and some of the partners also included people of the same sex. So, and there are actual document accounts of where people were in these various different relationships. I was looking at some stock video when I was doing a lot of research. I was very interested in learning more about my tribe. There was some stock video that I came across of a situation where the Apache tribe where I come from was trying to sort of move or follow the BIA to form the tribal government in kind of the same way. So they would have these court sessions and have these people that were sort of cheating on each other, and they would have to go to court for that. And the judge would be yelling at them, telling them that they're not to be living like that, that they're only supposed to have one wife, be in the home that they built for them, and they cannot catch them having extramarital affairs outside the marriage. So that was kind of interesting to sort of see, because, but also doing my reading, I found that there was a lot of accounts where Apaches didn't really have marriages. They were just pairing up with people that they were trusting. So this idea of marriage was kind of interesting that she brought up, and I can see the perspective that she was coming from in terms of the pressure from her family to get married, and the expectation of maybe grandkids, or allowing the family to get bigger. But of course, later on in the marriages, she did experience those moments of abuse, and it always seems that is the outcome. And I kind of see that same pattern with my mother, and even the relationships that I've had throughout my life. And again, this all brings me back to this idea of the past trauma, the historical trauma that we're sort of dealing with. And I just don't think it's incidental to the time period. I think it's something that is just inherited from generation to generation.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you both. Um, a major theme in the book is Ma-Nee's long struggle to achieve sobriety. And eventually she becomes a caretaker for many generations of family and her found family. Like they sort of say, your biological family and your logical family. Um, I'm curious what you think about the community that she gathered around her, And just as she continued to really become a real leader in AA and really help others along this path towards sobriety. Who'd like to go first? Terry has the smile, so.
For me, it's just sort of I'm conditioned to have women go first because I come from a matrilineal society. So that was my hesitation.
I'll go first if you prefer.
Okay.
I think in this day and age, we are acknowledging that there's so many people estranged from their families, and we're especially in the queer community, and we have the found families, like you said, Rex, and it was it kind of surprising for me to see that even though she grew up in such a remote area, it was still so colonized and so anti-queer and so Christian in their abusive Christian in their approach. Um, and I'm really glad that she found AA. Um, Most of my family struggles with addiction and alcoholism.
Thank you for sharing that part of your story, Terry.
Yeah, I think like Terry, this is a really hard subject to really talk about.
Right.
Because I think it is a topic that really impacts a lot of us. I know growing up, it was huge in our family. I'm a product of it. My mother is a product of it. Her mother is a product of this idea of addiction, uh, whether it's relationships or chemical dependency. There are these things that sort of govern the choices that we make and influence the choices that we make in our lifetime. Um, but I think one thing that I really liked about the story that she tells is that there's a moment, even though she has tried over and over and over to sort of overcome this addiction. Um, it was one of those moments, like I said, that is celebrated where she is able to help and care for other people. And I think that that's something I really connect with because I think that I was sort of drowning myself in my own selfishness in terms of addiction, chemical dependency, and whatever I was doing at the time. But I came to a moment where that I can either continue doing that or I can use the knowledge that I'm sort of gathering to help others. And because I was doing research at the time, because I really had this need of wanting to understand myself and knowing all the things that I was learning about, I decided at some point to sort of stop um, my abuse to myself and then begin to start helping people, which led me to the nonprofit section of work where I started doing the presentations and working with Two-Spirit people, indigenous communities, non-indigenous communities. And I did learn a whole lot from that. And it really empowered me to know that if there was somebody earlier on in my life that I could use or that would have influenced me, I probably would have started that earlier rather than later in life. But I think the journey that she has gone through is something that I connect with personally because I see that my own struggles were sort of similar struggles that she's had in her life, and this need to want to help because I over my own career, I've heard so many stories from young people just saying that they were kicked out of the house just for being who they were, and their families just turned them away, and they don't have anywhere to go. And especially working here in Denver, I've heard a lot of those stories over and over again. Um, and even seeing the community, the Native American community here, and seeing people that struggle with addiction, it's really hard to see and hard to sort of acknowledge because you know the pain that they're going through.
Yeah.
We are a traumatized people.
It's very true. And I thank you both for sharing your stories related to that.
And I think also that the idea that she wanted to belong, I think through this search of wanting to learn who she was or even embrace who she was, what I get through the whole story is that she was searching for family, searching for friends, for lovers, for companions, for even like community. There was this desperate search to want to belong, and that's one thing that I connected with in the story itself. And I think we do this as human beings. We want to belong, so we go look for that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's another great segue, just because another big part of the book is Ma-Nee sharing her coming out story and coming to her truth as being a lesbian. And there's a section, a paragraph of the book that I really loved, describing her feeling about coming out. Um, this is just on page 142. Uh, Different images come to my mind when I remember my experience of coming out. Some days I felt like I was unzipping a layer of unwanted skin and shedding it from my body like a snake so I could move freely for the first time. Other days I felt as if I was coming out of a dark prison cell into sunlight. And then there were days I saw myself as a piece of a jigsaw puzzle that, until then, had been forced into the wrong spaces, even into the wrong puzzle. But at last I'd found the right puzzle, and I fit very well. I think that goes so well with what you were just saying about her search for finding a place, finding community. Could you share some other thoughts or just your impressions of her coming out story?
I think when I went through that, when I was reading that part, I think what got her to that moment was remembering the things that she learned from her grandmother, remembering that there's tradition and there's culture, there's ceremony. And I think that really those ideas and principles, whenever she found herself in a moment of trauma, she always fell back on that. And I think that that's something that was really empowering. So when it did come time for her to come out, or this discovery, I think it was a very beautiful moment. Um, because these moments where even the metaphors that she uses in her story, this idea of shedding skin, removing layers, it's that inner part that you want to expose, hopefully to the light, and sort of allow it to sort of just be there in the light. And I think for her to tell a coming out story is an empowerment. Anybody's story of coming out is an empowerment. And I think a moment that should be celebrated. Um, because it's something that you're allowing yourself to experience and become more true to yourself of who you are. And that's such a hard thing to discover living the social climate that we live in.
Yeah, I agree.
I took the snake shedding skin part as like in my family, you were put into a box, and you were given a face to wear, and said, this is who you are, and this is how you're supposed to be, and this is how we fit into society, and even if you have to pretend, this is who we're going to be. And I think that it takes a lifetime to learn how to take that mask off and shed that skin and fill up the space that's actually yours instead of trying to cram into something that you don't fit into. And for her, she had that trauma with snakes, and so she's referring to snake in not in a good light. I love snakes, but yeah, it is, especially when you have so many facets to you. Like, I have all these intersections of disabled and queer and a shaggy. And so you have all these sides that you want to fit into the disabled community, but you kind of feel like you're not disabled enough, or you want to fit in with your indigenous community, but you're not native enough, or, and so you've been trying to find a way, but you've been askew for so long.
Right, right. There's a question that came in from Zan online that kind of goes with this theme of sort of feeling boxed in. And Zan, if you arrived late, you might look at this. Will be living on YouTube. So Chrysostos shared quite a bit about pronouns at the beginning of the presentation, so it might be worth going back and looking at. But the comment says, I have a question about pronouns. I've been appreciative of the use of inclusive pronouns that don't differentiate between different genders and how many native languages use such pronouns. At this time in my journey, I've not found a pronoun experience that works for me, and I sometimes wonder if it would make more sense to take a lesson from native languages and community and consider exploring the use of pronouns from a native language. So I wonder if you could share just your reactions or thoughts to that question, and your views on that topic.
I can only speak from my own use of my own indigenous language, but indigenous language is really kind of an interesting topic, because the way that it is spoken and how indigenous language, from my experience, it's not as linear as English. So I can understand that there's a lot of confusion as far as using English pronouns to define people. And unfortunately, again, that's another downside to Western culture. They like everything in these neat little boxes, which unfortunately a lot of indigenous communities don't fit. And so for me, I stopped fighting that. I am a person that likes to be fluid, and I would like for myself to exist where I'm supposed to be existing at whatever time that should be. And that's not really up to me. That's really for the moments that kind of come in and out of my life. So, which is the reason, again, why I used the X. And I find, like I said, I found out that it's used for a designation for gender nonconforming, which I thought, well, that's great, because that's something I'm trying to shed, is for people to stop assuming that whoever I am is giving them that power to assume that they know that much about me. So, I mean, but pronouns, indigenous people, well, at least again, in my own language, it really comes down to the way the language is spoken, in terms of how the pronouns are used. Because really, they don't talk about themselves as the first, second, and third. It's always kind of like the I that's always present, if that makes any sense. Like there's no he, there's no she. You only say that if you're talking about somebody else. But as far as the personal embracement of a pronoun, there's only I.
Interesting.
My tribe's language, I think the last time they counted, there were like 160 people that still speak the original Kituwa dialect of Cherokee. I don't know. I can only, like Chris said, I can only speak for my own experiences. I am fine with the she pronoun because I am female presenting, even though I'm not a binary woman. In my tribe, a binary woman is, and again, it's how you interact with your tribe and the role that you play to your tribe. I'm not a mother, so I'm two spirit, and I do tomboy things, and I do things that men would normally do, and that's acceptable. So it's not a manner of, oh, look at him, or hey, there's her over there. It's like, hey, you. It's how you speak it. It's not a confusing thing. Even like my tribe has 12 terms for gender. It's not a binary line of man, woman. It's a circle, and we make a full circle, and two spirits complete that circle and complete the circle in the powwow.
It's so interesting to learn about these different ways of viewing the world.
Even on that idea, I mean, there's so many different parts to me, and I don't ever say that I'm, just that one person or one thing. Because I mean, like Terry said, there's so many different facets, and fluidity is a huge part of how I express myself. I used to think that earlier that I walked in two worlds. I don't, because of those many facets that I have to sort of acknowledge,
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
I think it does. I think it does, and I think it's very interesting, and appreciate both of you sharing. Just
It's kind of like the medicine wheel. You see like the four colors, the four directions, and a lot of people think that means north, south, east, west, simple. No, there's up, there's down, there's inside, there's outside.
right.
It's spatial. It's not a line.
It's like a sphere.
Yeah.
Just a couple more questions before we wrap up for tonight. By the way, Terry, thank you so much for staying up late to participate in this, because your time zone is different from our time zone. So thank you for doing that. Ma-Nee talks about moving through the LGBTQ community of the early 80s, including AIDS activism, becoming active in lesbian communities, and trying to balance that with life with the community she grew up in. The other night, I was lucky enough to be at the One Colorado Ally Awards when the Ignacio Out and Equal Alliance received an award. And Edward Box, who's one of the co-founders, said, "I am a member of two minorities." I was wondering if you could talk about the tension that LGBTQ Native people feel walking in two worlds.
Well, I think what I can say on that is that I never really want to set those parameters of myself, because I used to do that, and that to me is very limiting. Because at one point I had to forgive my own self for designating and compartmentalizing who I was. And I started to understand that that was a very Western concept, that they wanted a clear definition of me representing a male, me representing men, me representing masculinity. Even in terms of my own ethnicity, they wanted to make sure that that's what I needed to represent. But for me, when I started thinking about that, I mean, I don't really want to give that power out anymore for others to define me. It's taken so much adversity, it's taken so much pain, all these various different parts of me to discover who I am. And for me, nobody else knows that. And it's up to me to want to share that. So therefore, I don't want to give any more power to those who want to assume things about me. Go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I didn't mean to. That goes very much with the comments you were just making about a completely different view of gender, very much more expansive than just, boy, girl.
Yeah, the reason that I believe this goes a lot back to my own traditional upbringing is that the reason why we don't see ourselves as male or female is because we introduce to ourselves formally, we introduce ourselves as human. And if you look at the idea of human, it doesn't designate by any means any category that we've been given in Western culture or Western concept. Because to be human, it's everything.
Terry, any other thoughts that you might want to share along this topic?
Chris said it really well.
Great. Well, one last question, just to sort of wrap up. Ma-Nee's life has been filled with incredible struggles, but at the end of the book, she describes her experience becoming an elder and ends the book on a note of gratitude for all the kind people that have cared for her throughout her life, even at her lowest. So what do you think are the reasons for that, and some of the things that readers can take away from Ma-Nee's story?
I think pretty much anybody watching this has suffered in some way. And when you have suffered, and it seems like when you've suffered a little bit and you think, wow, I've been through so much and that really makes me appreciate these good things. But then you suffer more and you appreciate those good things even more. And if you think about things that bring joy to your spirit, and you're like, man, I really feel that down in my spirit, and well, imagine having two spirits, and we feel things a lot bigger, I think. We have a lot more love to give. We have a lot more pain to feel. We have, you know, when I'm going through something really hard, there's two of me feeling that, and there's two of me feeling joy, and that it just bubbles over, and I share it when I can, and I think that it's really important to be grateful and to share the joy, because why be bitter and dwell on the bad things when you can take these bad things and learn from it. And that's the thing, another thing with two spirits and the queer indigenous communities, we're helpers. When you learn to heal yourself, then you've learned how to heal others. When you learn how to help yourself, then you can give a helping hand to other people, and that's what we do, is we pay it forward and just continue to grow.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think for me, just to sort of piggyback on that is, seeing people is probably the hardest part to ascertain in life. I mean, really seeing people.
Hmm.
And if you are able to allow yourself to get there, it can be the most rewarding thing in life to experience. And I think through my own journey, and also looking at what Ma-Nee has gone through, I think that we can get to that moment and get to that place where we can just see people and enjoy people, and maybe enjoy some of the rewards that that comes with.
Sometimes all anybody needs to hear is, hey, I see you.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for a really interesting discussion, and I think both of you have really shared some very personal things with the folks watching tonight. So I thank you just for sharing your story, because I think it'll give strength to other people, and I'm really grateful for it. Before we go, I just want to check and see if there's any other comments or any other thoughts you want to share with folks, or otherwise we can just say thank you and good night.
I can say that in my language.
What was that? I missed that.
No, I'll just say that usually when I depart, I just say Aheha, not Kagu Gujo, which means that you walk in beauty. Thank you, and walk in beauty.
Thank you.
I just wanted to address something really quickly, if I can.
Sure.
I'm studying to be a care doula and offering death doula services. It's a really important topic to the death positive movement. And I'm sorry if this upsets anybody, but it's really important to me to get this information out, especially in the queer and trans community. Anybody that is estranged from your family, please look into filling out a body disposition form. Even no matter how healthy you are, please have some kind of plan to assign a loved one to be the one that would be in charge of your remains in the event of your passing. It's free. You can file it with a hospital or a local mortuary or a death doula.
Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for studying a really important and underappreciated topic that I think
it wasn't by choice, but thank you.
Well, it's something that all of us need to learn more about. So I think I just want to say thank you again, and I hope you have a great night, and just really appreciate you sharing your experiences with us.
Thank you for having us.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.